Okay, let's unpack this. Let's really get into this core tension that I think defines so much of modern life. It's this relationship we have with our technology. It's supposed to be our most efficient tool, but for so many of us, for millions of people, it just feels like a constant drain, an obligation or even like a low-grade infection that we just can't seem to shake. We've really come to resent the very systems that were, sold to us as these ultimate solutions.
It's the great dilemma of the software age. You've absolutely nailed the premise right there. We all saw that prediction years ago, right?
Hmm.
That software was eating the world. But what seems to have actually happened is a little more insidious. Software didn't just consume the world, it created this massive, separate digital world of its own. And then it invited us all there to be consumed ourselves.
That feeling of being eaten, it's so palpable. You feel it every day, that digital noise, and it makes you crave a material anchor, something real. When technology felt good, it was always rooted in hardware, wasn't it? Something you could actually hold and fix and truly own. I remember being just genuinely thrilled by every new gadget release. It felt revolutionary, the design was ambitious, it was diverse, it was exciting. And now, somewhere in the 2010s and beyond, that whole feeling has just curdled into indifference or, often resentment, sometimes even outright fear.
And that resentment, I think, is rooted directly in the loss of that material connection you're talking about. Technology is no longer a physical tool that we wield. It's an invasive service that we merely license. So now we're just dealing with the fallout. We see these addiction cycles. We see mental health deteriorating because of mandatory screen time, chronic distraction, and this just crushing homogenization across every single platform and product.
So, our mission in this deep dive is to really trace that fundamental shift in perception. We need to understand exactly how we moved from being, delighted by novelty to being completely overwhelmed by digital noise. And then we need to look for concrete, actionable paths forward.
We'll explore how technology became this source of constant friction, and we'll investigate the corporate systems, things like digital rights management, DRM, that are explicitly designed to undermine your true ownership of the artifacts you pay for. But then, and this is the important part, we'll illuminate these powerful counter movements that are offering a path back, a way back to maybe technological affection.
Right. We'll be looking at solutions like the return to hardware diversity and the philosophical principles of something called slow technology, and also the democratizing force of open source hardware, which is, I think, fundamentally redefining what it means to actually own and use an artifact in the 21st century.
This journey isn't just about, a critique of modern tech. It's really an exploration of human agency. You have to acknowledge that while the potential of technology is just incredible, its current trajectory is creating systemic problems.
Yeah.
And these are problems that are going to require both political and very personal interventions to fix.
So let's rewind the clock. Let's go back to that so-called golden age of technology, the era just before that sense of, technological exhaustion really set in for good. The novelty back then was it was palpable, and it was driven primarily by this revolutionary, diverse hardware that felt like a tangible physical object. It had heft, it had purpose.
It was an era defined by discrete functions and physical objects. It's that simple. Just think about the iPod's debut. It was a genuine revolution. I mean, suddenly you could carry your entire music library. Thousands of songs, everything from the latest chart toppers to, I don't know, obscure pirate fighting sounds, whatever you were into. And you can do it without the cumbersome burden of physical tapes or CDs or those huge binders full of discs.
Oh, the binders. I remember them well. The iPod felt like a fundamental leap in convenience and capability, specifically because the hardware delivered what felt like a magical experience.
It really did. And the computers themselves were design statements, or at the very least, they were objects of distinct choice.
Right.
You had this immense diversity in personal computers. You could buy a desktop with its chunky, curvaceous monitor housing.
Like a big-ass booty, as they called it.
That's the one. Or maybe you preferred a sleek, professional laptop with that distinctive red-hot nipple in the middle, that little track point that everyone either absolutely loved or deeply hated.
There was no in-between on that one. But the key was that there was visual diversity and tactile diversity, and that correlated with real functional differences. You had options. It wasn't just a sea of identical aluminum slabs. If you bought a Dell versus a Compaq versus an Apple, you were getting a radically different aesthetic and a totally different interface experience. You had to actually choose your digital aesthetic, and that choice reinforced a sense of ownership, a sense of identity.
In gaming. Gaming was a cultural event, something that anchored you firmly in the material world. Console launches and even highly anticipated game launches were practically national holidays. Our sources mention this widespread phenomenon of businesses being rumored to have closed on the day Halo 3 came out, because so many people were camping outside stores just waiting for that midnight release.
I remember that. The level of public fervor was just incredible, and it reflected the genuine novelty of the products. The consoles felt distinct from each other. They offered different kinds of physical or graphical experiences. You had the high-resolution power of a new PlayStation, the online ecosystem of the Xbox, or the pure physical engagement of a Wii. People camped out for those releases because the products were novel, they were diverse, and they represented a distinct physical and communal event.
But the height of that hardware diversity, and maybe where the seeds of the subsequent homogenization were sown, it all revolved around phones. Buying a phone in that era, we're talking about models from Nokia, Razr, Sidekick, Barone, and BlackBerry, it was genuinely like buying a car. You had to sit down and actually weigh the pros and cons of all these unique models and their deployment mechanisms.
Absolutely. The design was the feature. Did it have a full sliding QWERTY keyboard? Did the screen flip up in some novel way? Did it have a proprietary messaging service? They had these unique shapes, varying sizes, different features. You had physical scroll wheels, dedicated MP3 buttons. The sheer diversity meant there was genuinely something for everyone. And it was worth camping out for because you were acquiring this novel, physically distinct artifact.
And now you walk into any phone store, and that diversity is functionally gone. They're all the same sleek black slab of glass. And that initial hope, that feeling of limitless possibility, it extended to the early internet too. It was this outlet for watching early content on YouTube, for connecting with long-lost school buddies on these nascent platforms like Google plus Burrs. There was this genuine hope that social media wouldn't just turn into a corrosive, polarizing environment, a Skeeto battlefield of who could be the most offensive or offended.
Hope that did not quite pan out. That initial sense of fun and novelty, it just evaporated so rapidly as software became the dominant force. It homogenized the entire user experience, and it introduced all this noise and friction where there had once been, seamless function.
And the most concrete sign of this joy disappearing is what we now call app overload. It's the friction introduced where there should have been seamless ease. Just look at how necessary services now require you to download multiple proprietary apps just to function.
It creates these completely unnecessary barriers to daily life. It drives me crazy. You simply want to look at a restaurant menu or place an order, and instead of a simple web page, you're immediately thrown into the App Store. And you have to download their proprietary app, which often demands you sign up for an account just to view a PDF. The technology is no longer solving a problem, it is actively creating one. Or even more absurdly, the basic function of commuting. You need one dedicated app for the municipal train system and a different, completely unrelated app for the bus system, even within the exact same city. And each one requires its own login, its own payment method, its own notification permissions. The peak of this systemic absurdity, and this perfectly illustrates how technology prioritizes compliance over actual human need, is that example cited in our sources. Imagine checking into the emergency room with a severe physical injury. Maybe you have the sword of a Sengoku period ninja in your chest. You're in a crisis. And the person behind the desk asks you to scan a QR code to complete your check-in through an app.
It's unbelievable. When you are dealing with a major physical injury or a medical emergency, the very last thing you should have to contend with is a technological barrier. If you don't have the app, the instruction is to scan another QR code to download the app. So the technology is no longer serving us in a crisis. It's demanding rigid compliance. It's replacing human flexibility with this kind of digital absurdity.
In social media, it just completely lost the plot. All the platforms started incorporating features from all the others, trying to be the catch-all app. Instagram wanted to be Snapchat, which wanted to be TikTok, which wanted to be YouTube, and the net result of all this feature cannibalization is just this utterly bland, functional overlap.
The homogenization is relentless. Every single app now seems to have some form of a TikTok feature or a story feature, even apps for incredibly niche purposes. Like you said, a guitar tabs app or a weather app. They force you to contend with short-form video content, often just random noise that detracts from the original purpose. The essential functionality gets buried beneath this constant need to capture and hold your attention.
And the content itself often feels like noise. It's cryptic, it's performative, it's utterly meaningless. You know what I mean? Those overly aesthetic Instagram captions that say, "Golden hour with my golden girlies." There's no utility, there's no purpose. It's just a persistent layer of distracting noise over everything we try to do.
Technology has transitioned from being a seamless problem solver into what our sources call an invasive rash.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a tool you pick up anymore. It's always there, it's vibrating, it's lighting up, reminding you, hey, I'm here, pay attention to me. And the societal expectation to respond instantly is now so high that if you don't respond to a text or an email for even a few hours, people freak out. They assume you've been in an accident or that you're deliberately ignoring them.
The pressure is immense, and you can't simply opt out. Not really. Not when technology is so deeply integrated into everyday life. I mean, so many jobs, financial systems, transportation networks, communication channels, they literally require a smartphone to function. And that homogenization we see in the software, it extends physically now. The choice is gone. Every phone is an iPhone clone, and nearly every car sold now is a crossover SUV. They're functional, sure, but uniformly uninspiring.
It's true. The lack of diversity and the constant friction caused by this invasive software. That is the fertile ground from which our collective technological resentment grows. We used to seek out something unique, and now we are force-fed a one-size-fits-all imposition.
So this transition from novelty and true ownership to just noise and invasive licensing, it didn't happen by accident. It was facilitated by specific, calculated control mechanisms, primarily implemented through software to assert power over the physical hardware you supposedly bought. And this is the domain of digital rights management, DRM.
DRM is the invisible gatekeeper that turns true ownership into conditional access. It's often packaged and presented as a way to protect intellectual property, which, is a legitimate business need, but manufacturers have aggressively weaponized it. They extend DRM to restrict how consumers can interact with the hardware they have legally paid for, making it an intentional, frustrating barrier to independent repair and modification.
And this fundamentally alters the nature of the consumer relationship, doesn't it? We no longer engage in what you'd call outright ownership of a tangible artifact. What we're actually buying is, as the source puts it, merely a manufacturer-controlled license for its functionality. So DRM dictates this conditional ownership, meaning the manufacturer reserves the right to deny service, block functionality, or even remotely disable the device if it detects unauthorized components or non-proprietary modifications.
And this mechanism is a powerful enabler of planned obsolescence. It's often achieved by weaponizing the proprietary firmware. That's the low-level software that controls the hardware. For instance, a persistent functional instability might show up as a simple glitch. Maybe a physical control key acts as if it's permanently stuck. While the fix might be a simple software patch or a hardware swap, the root cause could be a deeper instability within the firmware that's designed to restrict independent maintenance.
And if DRM prevents consumers or, and this is crucial, independent repair shops, from accessing the core diagnostic systems and specific software pairings needed to address these issues, it effectively blocks necessary cost-effective repairs. It forces you into the expensive replacement of the entire unit. It's a strategy that intentionally compels consumers back into the manufacturer's product plus service ecosystem, entrenching corporate control and maximizing profit from repeat purchases.
The practical consequences of this intentional denial of service are just frustrating and costly. We have documented examples from customer service centers for gaming consoles that were known for high failure rates. If a technical support agent found that a customer had tampered with the device, either physically or by modifying the firmware, even if they were willing to pay for the repair hardware service was denied, flat out.
Right. And the manufacturer's rationale is always about protecting against piracy, arguing the modification could facilitate unauthorized use, but punishing the customer by denying the right to repair the physical object they bought, even for a completely unrelated defect, that goes far beyond protecting IP. Piracy should result in a ban from the online service, not the denial of the right to fix a broken power supply.
Exactly. And this frustration, it permeates every aspect of technology. You can look at the Sonos forum documentation. Customers noted that after a software update, their Connect.amp hardware was allegedly broken by the company, and they were simply refused to fix. They were forced instead to buy new, incompatible hardware. This conditional ownership means you don't control the lifespan of your own possessions.
And this corporate control, maintained through licensing restrictions and restrictive firmware, is precisely what gave powerful and, I'd say, necessary rise to the right to repair movement.
The right to repair is both a philosophical assertion and a legislative goal, to reclaim ownership of our purchases. Its primary legislative goal is to mandate that manufacturers provide consumers and independent repair shops with access to the necessary information. That means genuine OEM parts, specialized diagnostic tools, and even firmware access codes that are required to fix their own electronics.
And that point needs emphasis. It's not just about accessing manuals and parts. It's about accessing the proprietary digital tools that allow a new screen, for example, to be properly paired with the existing phone motherboard. Or for a tractor owner to download the diagnostic software needed to fix a simple engine sensor. This access extends the device's functional life, it dramatically reduces the need for constant replacement, and critically, it cuts down on the staggering amount of e-waste generated globally.
Developers themselves have a crucial role to play here. While, NDAs and licensing agreements exist, they need to advocate internally for responsible DRM practices. The goal should be to limit DRM strictly to protecting the software license, the code itself, rather than using firmware as a watchdog that monitors and restricts how the consumer uses their physical hardware.
Right. When developers support open source communities and prioritize customer rights over corporate overreach, they start building that bridge back toward trust. And yeah, maybe back to that feeling of technological affection. It means moving away from intentional friction and back toward lasting durability.
So if the problem we've identified is one of speed, consumption, homogenization, and disposability, the philosophical antidote seems to be something called slow technology. And this is a deliberate, conscious challenge to the conventional tech model that just worships rapid iteration.
That's absolutely right. Slow technology forces a fundamental paradigm shift away from these traditional growth-obsessed metrics. We stop measuring success solely by efficiency, speed, and mass consumption. And instead, we begin measuring it by well-being, sustainability, and reflection. The entire objective shifts toward a more human-centered engagement with our digital tools.
And this philosophy, it isn't just abstract. It manifests in four fundamental design pillars that are completely antithetical to planned obsolescence. First, durability. Building objects that are intended to last for decades, not just 2 years. Second, repairability. Ensuring they can be fixed by the end user or any independent technician when they inevitably break.
Third, modularity. Designing technology so that specific components like cameras, batteries, or storage can be easily swapped and upgraded. That prevents the forced replacement of an entire system just because one part failed or became outdated. And fourth, human-centered design. Ensuring the technology is unobtrusive, that it serves our lives and our goals, rather than consuming our attention and dictating our behavior.
If we contrast the product lifecycle, conventional tech is built on this continuous pressure for rapid iteration and just discarding the old. Slow tech, by contrast, prioritizes longevity and a radical reduction of e-waste. And this also implies a fundamental shift in our consumption cycle, moving away from impulsive, frequent upgrades and toward mindful acquisition and long-term stewardship.
This shift speaks directly to that craving for material anchors we identified earlier. Since invasive software has eaten our attention, we're seeking physical relief and intentionality, which leads us to the return of touch, or what are called tactile user interfaces, TUI.
The exhaustion of the modern user comes largely from spending excessive amounts of time interacting with purely visual, flat, smooth digital screens. TUI reintroduces the critical, grounding sense of touch into our digital realm. This means incorporating physical elements like robust buttons, satisfyingly heavy switches, textured surfaces, and intentional, meaningful vibrational feedback back into product design.
I love that. This focus on physicality, it demands deliberate interaction. You have to physically reach out and flick a switch to silence a notification rather than just tapping a glass pane mindlessly. This directly supports digital minimalism. It moves us away from passive, high screen time engagement toward conscious, boundaries-driven interaction. When your interaction is physical and intentional, it significantly supports better cognitive health.
It makes the technology feel like an instrument again. It demands presence. But we can't just wait for manufacturers to fix our relationship with technology entirely. We, the consumers, have to reclaim our habits. The analysis from our sources shows a clear, consistent correlation between increased screen time and decreased mental health. This demands conscious behavioral boundaries.
Which means the behavioral interventions are critical. We need to implement rigid, self-enforced limits on daily screen time, treating it almost like a budget. And furthermore, we should commit to checking non-critical communications like social media or email only at specific designated points during the day, maybe once mid-morning and once late afternoon, rather than constantly reacting to the immediate ping of every single notification.
And we must reclaim the material space that technology has so aggressively invaded, our personal and communal relationships. Technology often displaces face-to-face interaction, which is fundamentally essential for emotional expression, for developing empathy, and for fulfilling the human need for belonging.
A key and I think profound intervention here is strictly enforcing no screens at meals. That rule, as simple as it sounds, forces the conscious cultivation of meaningful connections and promotes mindful living. It reinforces the inherent value of physical presence over digital mediation. It anchors us firmly back in the material world we are actually trying to live in.
Beyond the philosophical and behavioral shifts of slow technology, there's a very practical entrepreneurial movement making these principles a material reality. It's called open source hardware, or OSH. This phenomenon is driven by a truly unique set of motivations that fundamentally challenges traditional competitive business models.
It's the ultimate form of democratizing the artifact. We're talking about newly built firms that choose to license their complete product design, including the schematics, CAD files, sometimes even the firmware, under open source licenses. They are explicitly inviting their customers, their competitors, and the broader community to examine, critique, and freely use the design for their own purposes.
It seems like a fundamentally risky and abnormal commercialization strategy, right? I mean, pioneering firms typically spend billions protecting their intellectual property, their IP, to capture commercial value and gain market power. These OSH entrepreneurs are deliberately foregoing that protection. How can they possibly survive?
That's the critical question, and it's why the interviews conducted with these OSH firm founders revealed a fascinating dual set of motivations. They're split between intrinsic, altruistic factors and practical extrinsic business factors. They really are balancing this selfless community creation with profit-driven business leadership.
Let's delve into those intrinsic factors first, because they speak to that deep desire to re-enchant technology. Many founders are driven by personal satisfaction or self-enjoyment and deep altruism. This includes helping underserved populations, feeling a strong moral obligation to democratize access to expensive technology, and experiencing a profound sense of reciprocity.
That reciprocity factor is key. The founders often learn when the community comments on their inventions. They get bug fixes, suggestions for material changes, or truly thoughtful and inspiring ideas that they themselves can then incorporate. It becomes a form of high-quality distributed research and development that money alone just can't buy.
So while they give up direct control over the IP, they gain this powerful R&D ecosystem. But the extrinsic practical factors are equally strong, and they show that open sourcing isn't purely idealistic. OSH firms often find they can respond rapidly to market demand. They achieve a much faster time to market because they skip those lengthy patent filing processes, and critically, they realize lowered R&D costs because the community does the testing.
And perhaps most surprisingly, they see lowered customer support costs. Since the design is open, the community often diagnoses, troubleshoots, and shares fixes for common problems online. And that relieves the firm of the primary burden of customer service for all the minor issues.
The case studies in altruism really bring this movement to life. Take Faraday Motion, a firm that created an e-skateboard design and shared it openly. The founder, who had experienced an accident that resulted in reduced mobility, realized that by making the design available, he could enable people who lack normal mobility to build the board cheaply, move fast, and regain a feeling of being mobile and looking cool.
That is a powerful example of necessity driving innovation for the public good. And another firm, X3 in Japan, produces open-source designs for 3D printable prosthetic limbs. They realized that standard insurance-provided limbs were often heavy, overly large, or prohibitively expensive for average families and, specifically, thinner women. So their goal was simple: provide highly customizable, affordable options for those who needed them most.
And we see the immediate democratizing effect on complex, expensive technologies. OpenRV, a U.S. firm, produces underwater robots. Before their intervention, a basic entry-level underwater robot cost around $20,000. That placed it far out of reach for students, hobbyists, or normal customers. By making the design open source, they radically reduced the cost and made complex technology accessible to anyone with a 3D printer and some basic electronics knowledge.
This fundamentally shows that IP protection is just one mechanism for commercial success. In the OSH space, lead time, complementary sales like selling specialized components or selling services, and cultivating a strong collaborative community relationship provide these critical complementary capabilities. And those often increase productivity and long-term viability far better than a simple patent ever could.
It's important to acknowledge the changing identity of these founders, too. They often start as passionate hobbyist makers who value collaboration, sharing, and openness. But over time, as the company grows, they evolve into professional managers who must make difficult decisions about scaling production, managing risk, and being responsible for the livelihoods of their employees. This transition from maker to manager is an ongoing challenge in the OSH world, that tension between openness and fiduciary duty.
So when we talk about the incredible complexity of the current technological system, all the required apps, the invasive software, the constant pressure to upgrade, it's not just annoying on a personal level, it's creating friction that mirrors these profound economic and existential consequences globally. The system itself is reaching a critical point of diminishing returns.
And this is the critical transition, where we connect the user's micro-frustration, that exhaustion from the invasive rash, to these macro-level risks. We can draw on concepts like the generalization of Bostrup's observation by Joseph Tainter, which argues that complexity eventually consumes far more resources in maintenance than it generates in new solutions. Every sustained problem-solving endeavor suffers from diminishing returns on investment in complexity.
So solving problems with technology initially works, but eventually the cost of the solution starts to outweigh the benefit. How do you see this in real-world innovation?
Well, you see it as exponentially increasing resource investment for linear or even declining returns. Just look at technical innovation in the mid-20th century. To achieve the same number of annual patent applications in the U.S. in 1958 as in 1946, the country needed twice as many scientists and engineers and 3 times the financial investment. We were working harder just to stay in the same place.
And that inefficiency has accelerated into the digital age, I would imagine.
Oh, absolutely. The pharmaceutical industry provides a terrifying example with something called Eroom's Law, which is Moore's Law spelled backward. It states that the cost of drug discovery doubles roughly every 9 years. So R&D efficiency in pharmaceutical discoveries decreased by an astonishing factor of 100 between 1950 and 2010. We are pouring orders of magnitude more money into R&D for fewer breakthroughs.
And even in cutting-edge fields like AI, which promises endless efficiency, complexity is consuming resources at an alarming rate.
Precisely. Deep learning is vaunted as the great solution, but it's facing these crippling rising economic and environmental costs. Training larger, more complex models requires staggering amounts of computational energy, specialized hardware that rapidly becomes e-waste, and an enormous financial investment that few can afford. And that consolidates control in a handful of massive firms.
So the harder society tries to solve problems by introducing more layers of technology and complexity, the less productive our solutions become, and the greater the maintenance burden.
That's Tainter's core thesis applied to technology. Each new societal or technological problem requires new institutions, new specialists, and more complexity to manage it. Think of regulatory bodies, cybersecurity experts, legal frameworks for data privacy. This dramatically increases maintenance energy costs, both literal and intellectual.
And what happens when that maintenance cost becomes too high?
Eventually, a society uses up the majority of its available energy in surplus just maintaining all the previously implemented solutions and their requisite complexity. When marginal returns diminish to zero, the society becomes intensely sensitive to threats and critically incapable of mobilizing resources to tackle any new threat. Painter suggests this mechanism leads to systemic collapse, irrespective of specific factors or circumstances. So not because of invasion or plague, but simply because the system becomes too brittle and too expensive to sustain itself.
That paints a very dark picture of continuous, unchecked technological growth. It increases systemic fragility rather than reducing it, and that structural fragility brings us directly to existential risks, resulting from complex, rapidly developing technology.
One area of immediate and critical concern is the intersection of military AI and nuclear weapon systems. The global catastrophic risk, or GCR potential here, is significantly higher than in previous eras, and that's due to the introduction of machine speed and autonomy into decision-making.
The complexity shortens the window for human intervention.
Exactly. New technologies like hypersonics and increasingly sophisticated AI shortens decision timelines dramatically. Furthermore, the introduction of warhead ambiguity, where it's unclear whether a launching missile carries a conventional or a nuclear payload, raises the likelihood of miscalculation and rapid nuclear escalation. And that could be through either intentional means or, more chillingly, unintentional system failures.
Beyond military applications, we also see the constant threat of the surveillance trap facilitated by advanced technology. Totalitarian regimes have always used surveillance in the name of security and social control, but advanced AI and ubiquitous connectivity are making this easier and more complete than ever before.
And we must acknowledge that even in democratic societies, this is a profound risk. AI and machine learning may be used to further political or corporate ends under the guise of public protection. And this can lead to totalitarian tendencies that erode essential freedoms, especially freedom of thought and speech. When pervasive surveillance breaks down the division between our public actions and our private thoughts, genuine freedom of expression ceases to exist in any meaningful sense.
This all underscores the fact that technology and its creators are not neutral. They are embedded in and driven by specific socio-technical processes. Therefore, governance is absolutely paramount, but it's also incredibly difficult to execute effectively.
That difficulty is often summarized by the Collingreach dilemma. This concept posits that new technologies are easiest to govern, control, and shape when they were still novel and less is known about their ultimate impact. However, once a technology becomes fully embedded in society, once it's everywhere, like the smartphone, its ultimate impact becomes clear. But it is simultaneously almost impossible to govern or change its course. Governance tends to lag behind innovation, always reacting too late.
Which means we need a policy engagement from a diverse, scientifically informed group at the very outset. We need to ensure we move beyond the false dichotomy of simply choosing either over or under regulation. We need informed, timely intervention. So what does this all mean? We've traced a pretty comprehensive history here, moving from a nostalgic past of diverse, exciting hardware physical artifacts we could actually own to a present reality of invasive, homogenized software that creates chronic friction instead of ease.
And we learned that this shift was not accidental. It was driven by corporate systems like DRM and planned obsolescence that stripped away our sense of true ownership. This led to systemic fragility at the micro level, our personal exhaustion, and at the macro level, through this crippling complexity that is leading toward diminishing returns on innovation.
But we identified powerful counterforces that are fighting for reenchantment. The philosophical movement of slow technology, which prioritizes durability, repairability, and well-being over consumption and speed. And the entrepreneurial, altruistic engine of open-source hardware, which democratizes access and proves that openness, when it's managed strategically, can be a more powerful business model than secrecy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, our journey shows that reclaiming a positive, healthy relationship with technology requires two simultaneous actions. We need to change our behavior on a micro level, and we need to push for systemic political change on a macro level.
The practical, behavioral steps are about setting firm, conscious boundaries to reclaim our presence. We need to enforce no screens at meals to cultivate meaningful material connections. And we must consciously limit our daily screen time to boost our cognitive and mental health. These are the interventions that return agency to our daily lives.
And systemically, we must advocate relentlessly for right-to-repair legislation. We have to ensure it provides access not just to parts and manuals, but to the diagnostic software and proprietary tools that are necessary for true, independent maintenance. We must support firms and designers who prioritize durability, modularity, and openness over the toxic cycle of quick consumption and planned obsolescence.
To find satisfaction, we have to reconcile our need for technology with the massive, complex global risks its unchecked growth creates. And this leads us to one final provocative thought for you to consider as you move forward.
We discussed how the classical definition of existential risk labels any threat that prevents humanity from achieving technological maturity, that unbounded, perfect, techno-utopian future, often involving space colonization or mastery over nature, as a catastrophe. What's critical is that this definition labels both unchecked growth and economic stability or limits to growth as existential threats if they stop that upward march to perfection.
This raises a powerful question. If we define good or desirable technology solely by its ability to push us toward an unbounded, perfect, techno-utopian future, are we inherently setting ourselves up for chronic resentment, dissatisfaction, and failure right here on Earth? We must determine if we are willing to accept the supposed flaws of non-perfection, be it the limitations of planetary boundaries or the natural diversity and complexity of humanity, in order to find satisfaction, safety, and reenchantment in the technological reality of the present. This challenges the obsession with constant, unsustainable upward growth that currently defines the entire technological paradigm.